Welcome to this journey into the forgotten shadows of American history. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across different places and hours, knowing that darkness touches us all differently, yet universally. My name is Samuel, and this is another chapter in our exploration of the macabre truths hidden beneath the surface of ordinary lives. Today, we travel back to 1891 to the rural expanses of Harlan County, Kentucky, a place where fog clings to the valleys like a burial shroud, and where the mountains keep secrets better than any vault. In the autumn of that year, something was discovered in the basement of the Sanders family homestead that would shake the foundations of a small community and raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. Two brothers, Andrew Sanders, 34 years old, and Matthew Sanders, 29, had been living on the isolated property for nearly 3 years following the death of their parents. To their neighbors, they were peculiar but harmless, reclusive men who kept to themselves, maintained their late father's modest farm, and rarely ventured into town except for necessary supplies. But on October 17, 1891, a discovery was made that revealed the Sanders brothers were hiding something far more sinister than simple eccentricity, something that had been festering in the darkness beneath their home, something that involved the missing women of Harlan County. 3 young women had vanished over the course of 18 months. Sarah Brennan, 22, disappeared in March of 1890 while walking home from a church social. Elizabeth Crane, 19, was last seen in September of that same year, leaving the general store at dusk. And Catherine Wells, 24, vanished without a trace in June of 1891, her horse found wandering riderless near the Sanders property line. The local sheriff, a man named Jacob Thornton, had conducted searches. He'd questioned witnesses. He'd followed leads that went nowhere, like trails that simply ended at the edge of the forest. The community whispered about runaways, about wild animals, about the dangers young women faced in those remote hollows. But no one, absolutely no one, suspected what was actually happening less than 4 miles from the town center, until the smell became impossible to ignore. A neighbor, Elias Grant, had been passing by the Sanders homestead on his way to the timber mill when he noticed something unusual. The brothers, typically so private, had left their property in haste, and the front door stood open, swaying slightly in the October wind. Grant, concerned that something might be wrong, approached the house. That's when the odor hit him. Not the smell of death he knew from butchering livestock or hunting. This was something else entirely, something sweet and rotten and profoundly wrong. He called for the sheriff. What Sheriff Thornton found in the basement of that house would be documented in reports that were later sealed by county officials, deemed too disturbing for public record. But fragments survived, testimonies, journal entries, letters that paint a picture of horror so complete, so methodically constructed, that it challenges our understanding of human depravity. This is the story of the Sanders brothers and the macabre secret they kept in their family basement, a secret that involved not just murder, but something far more unspeakable, a violation of the boundary between life and death itself. The question isn't just what they did, it's why. And perhaps more disturbingly, were they the only ones? To understand what happened in that basement, we must first understand the world that created the Sanders brothers. Harlan County, Kentucky in 1891 was a place defined by isolation, hardship, and a particular relationship with death that might seem foreign to modern sensibilities. The county had been established in 1819, carved from the eastern mountains of Kentucky, where the Appalachian Range creates natural barriers between communities. By the late 19th century, Harlan County was known primarily for coal mining and timber. industries that brought both prosperity and tragedy in equal measure. Mine collapses were common. Industrial accidents claimed lives with disturbing regularity. Death was not an abstract concept here. It was a neighbor, a constant presence in the lives of families who scratched out existence from unforgiving land. The Sanders family had deep roots in this soil. Records from the Harlan County courthouse show that Nathaniel Sanders, the father of Andrew and Matthew, had arrived in the region in 1851, purchasing 160 acres of forested land along Clover Fork Creek. Nathaniel was listed in census records as a funeral agent, a profession that, in rural Kentucky, meant something quite different from what we might imagine today. In communities where proper undertakers were scarce and distances were great, funeral agents served multiple roles. They prepared bodies for burial in private homes. They constructed coffins. They advised on preservation techniques in the days before modern embalming. And they maintained what passed for funeral customs in a region where poverty often dictated that families couldn't afford elaborate services. Nathaniel Sanders had learned these practices from his own father in Virginia, and he passed them down to his sons. According to a letter preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, written by a local pastor named Reverend Thomas McKinley in 1873, Nathaniel was considered skilled in the arts of the dead, though unsettling in his methods and peculiar in his manner of speaking about the deceased, as if they retained some form of presence even after the soul's departure. This detail is important. The Sanders family didn't just live near death. They worked with it, touched it, prepared it for presentation. In doing so, they crossed thresholds that most people never approached. And somewhere in that crossing, something went terribly wrong. Andrew Sanders was born in 1857, during a particularly harsh winter that killed dozens in the county. His mother, Margaret Sanders, died during his brother Matthew's birth in 1862, a victim of childbed fever. From that point forward, Nathaniel raised his two sons alone in the isolated homestead, training them in the family trade as soon as they were old enough to assist. By all accounts, the Sanders boys were quiet children. School records from the one-room schoolhouse they attended until age 12 described them as withdrawn but obedient, showing aptitude for reading and writing but little interest in socializing with other children. A former classmate, interviewed decades later in 1953 by a graduate student researching Harlan County history, recalled that Andrew and Matthew always sat together, whispered to each other, and seemed to exist in their own world, as if the rest of us weren't quite real to them. When Nathaniel Sanders died in 1888 from consumption, his sons inherited everything: the property, the tools of the trade, and whatever dark knowledge he had imparted over years of working in the shadows between life and death. The funeral was small. Few attended. And within months, the brothers had withdrawn almost entirely from community life. They stopped accepting work as funeral agents, despite the need for such services in the area. They allowed the farm to deteriorate, maintaining only a small vegetable garden and a few chickens. Neighbors who passed by reported seeing lights burning in the house at strange hours, 3, 4 in the morning, and hearing sounds that seemed wrong somehow. Not quite digging, not quite building, something in between. The local general store ledger, preserved in the county historical archives, shows a disturbing pattern in the brothers' purchases during 1889 and 1890, large quantities of lime, formaldehyde solution which had recently become available through medical supply catalogues, yards of muslin cloth, lantern oil in amounts that seemed excessive for a household of 2 men, and books, specifically medical texts about anatomy and preservation, ordered through the store from publishers in Philadelphia and Boston. The storekeeper, a man named Harold Wickham, later testified that Andrew Sanders had once asked him, whether he knew of any chemicals that could keep flesh from changing, from becoming what it becomes. When Wickham asked why he needed such information, Andrew simply smiled and said, "For professional purposes. Father always said we should improve upon the old methods." But the Sanders brothers weren't preparing bodies for burial. They weren't serving the community as their father had, however strangely. They were preparing for something else entirely, something that required privacy, a darkness, and an isolation so complete that screams, if there were screams, would be swallowed by the surrounding forest and never reach human ears. By March of 1890, when Sarah Brennan disappeared, the brothers had been alone on their property for nearly 2 years, and the basement beneath their house had been transformed into something that defied explanation, something that awaited discovery for another 18 months, until that October morning when Elias Grant smelled the unmistakable odor of rotting flesh and called for the sheriff. What Sheriff Thornton found in that basement wasn't just evidence of murder, it was evidence of something far more disturbing, a systematic practice, carefully documented, that revealed the Sanders brothers had crossed a line that most people cannot even conceive of crossing. The first disappearance occurred on March 14, 1890. Sarah Brennan, 22 years old, had attended a Wednesday evening social at the Harlan Methodist Church. It was a clear night, unusually warm for mid-March, and Sarah had decided to walk the 2 miles back to her family's farm rather than wait for her father to collect her by wagon. Several witnesses saw her leave the church around 8:30 in the evening, carrying a small oil lamp to light her way. She never arrived home. Her father, Patrick Brennan, organized a search party at dawn. 30 men combed the roads and forests between the church and the Brennan property. They found her lamp, still intact, lying in the grass approximately 1 mile from the church, near the intersection where the main road passed within half a mile of the Sanders homestead. There was no sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. The lamp had simply been set down or dropped, and Sarah Brennan had vanished. Sheriff Thornton investigated. He questioned everyone who had been at the church social. He examined the spot where the lamp was found. He even walked the route himself several times, looking for anything that might explain what happened. His official report, filed on March 20, 1890, concluded, "No evidence of foul play discovered. Possible that Miss Brennan became disoriented in the darkness and wandered into the forest. Search continuing." But the search turned up nothing. No body, no clothing, no trace of Sarah Brennan beyond that lamp lying in the grass, its oil still half full, the wick trimmed and ready to burn. The community mourned. Theories circulated. Some believed she had been attacked by a wild animal, though no animal attacks had been reported in the region for years. Others whispered about a drifter, someone passing through who had seized an opportunity. A few of the more superstitious residents spoke of the old stories, the Appalachian legends about spirits that lured young women into the mountains, never to return. No one suspected the Sanders brothers. Why would they? The brothers kept to themselves, but they had never caused trouble. They were strange, yes, but strangeness wasn't a crime, and they had alibis, such as they were. When questioned by Sheriff Thornton 3 days after Sarah's disappearance, both Andrew and Matthew stated they had been home that evening, working in their basement on family papers and accounts. They seemed appropriately concerned about the missing woman, expressing sympathy for the Brennan family. The sheriff noted in his report that the Sanders brothers appeared nervous, but this is consistent with their naturally retiring disposition. 6 months passed. The mystery of Sarah Brennan became one of those tragedies that small communities absorb, never forget, but eventually accept as unsolvable. Her name was added to prayers at the Methodist Church. Her mother wore black. Life continued as it always does, even in the shadow of unanswered questions. Then, in September of 1890, Elizabeth Crane disappeared. Elizabeth was 19, the daughter of a coal mine foreman. On September 23rd, she visited the general store in Tytundadi town to purchase fabric for a dress she was making. Harold Wickham, the storekeeper, remembered her well. She'd been cheerful, excited about an upcoming harvest dance. She left the store around 5:30 in the evening, just as the sun was beginning to set. The road from town to the Crane family home passed even closer to the Sanders property than the route Sarah Brennan had taken. Elizabeth's horse was found the next morning, still saddled, grazing near the edge of the Sanders land. Her purchases from the store, 3 yards of blue cotton fabric, were still secured in the saddlebag, but Elizabeth herself was gone. This time, the search was more extensive, more urgent. 1 disappearance could be explained away. 2 stretched the boundaries of coincidence. Sheriff Thornton expanded his investigation. He questioned the Sanders brothers again. This time, he asked to see their property. Andrew Sanders refused, not aggressively, not in a way that immediately raised suspicion. He simply stated that the property was private, that they had nothing to do with Miss Crane's disappearance, and that allowing strangers to wander their land would be disrespectful to their late father's memory. Without evidence of wrongdoing, without a warrant, Sheriff Thornton had no legal authority to search the premises. He noted Andrew's refusal in his report. He noted the proximity of both disappearances to the Sanders property. But he also noted that correlation wasn't causation and that dozens of other properties were equally close to the locations where the women had vanished. The investigation stalled. Elizabeth Crane's family offered a reward for information. Wanted posters were distributed throughout the county. Suspicion began to fall on various individuals. A traveling peddler who had been in the area, a mine worker with a history of drinking, even the church pastor who had been seen speaking with Sarah Brennan on the night she disappeared. But no evidence materialized. No witnesses came forward with credible information, and as autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, the mystery deepened without resolution. Then came June of 1891, and Catherine Wells. Catherine was 24, a schoolteacher who lived with her elderly aunt on a small farm near Clover Fork Creek. On June 12th, she left to visit a 6-students family, carrying a basket of food and medicine. The student's home was about 5 miles from her aunt's farm. The route required her to pass within a 1/4 mile of the Sanders property. She never arrived at the student's home. Her horse was found 3 days later, wandering near the Sanders property line, saddle askew, reins trailing in the dirt. The basket was gone, and Catherine Wells had joined Sarah Brennan and Elizabeth Crane in the growing list of women who had simply ceased to exist. This time, the community's response was different. Fear had transformed into anger. 3 women, 3 disappearances, all within roughly the same area, and all connected, however tenuously, to the land surrounding the Sanders homestead. A group of men, led by Patrick Brennan, Sarah's father, confronted Sheriff Thornton. They demanded action. They demanded that the Sanders property be searched, legal niceties be damned. Their daughters were missing, their sisters, their neighbors, and the law seemed powerless to do anything about it. Sheriff Thornton, aware that he was losing control of the situation, agreed to obtain a search warrant. He traveled to the county seat, presented his case to the circuit judge, and returned with legal authorization to search the Sanders property on June 20th, 1891. But when he arrived at the homestead with 6 deputized men, he found the house empty. The brothers were gone. They had left in haste, apparently. The front door was unlocked, dishes were still on the table, a fire had burned down to embers in the hearth. It appeared they had fled sometime during the night. Sheriff Thornton and his men searched the house. They found nothing immediately suspicious on the ground floor: old furniture, dusty books, the accumulated debris of a family that had lived in the same place for 40 years. But then they opened the door to the basement, and the smell hit them like a physical force. Tell us in the comments what you think happened in that basement. What do you imagine Sheriff Thornton and his men found when they descended those stairs? Because what they discovered would haunt every single one of them for the rest of their lives. The basement of the Sanders homestead was accessed through a heavy wooden door in the kitchen. Sheriff Thornton's hand, according to his own later testimony, trembled as he pulled it open. The smell that rose from below was overwhelming, not just the odor of decomposition, but something chemical, something artificial mixed with organic decay. Formaldehyde, lime, and underneath it all, the unmistakable sweetness of rotting flesh. Deputy Marcus Flynn, one of the 6 men who accompanied the sheriff, vomited before they even descended the stairs. Another deputy, Samuel Pritchard, later wrote in a private letter to his brother, "I have been to war. I saw men torn apart by cannon fire at Chickamauga. I thought I knew what death looked like, what it smelled like, but nothing prepared me for what we found beneath that house." The stairs were steep and narrow, constructed of rough-hewn timber that creaked under their weight. Sheriff Thornton went first, holding a lantern high. The basement was larger than expected, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house, approximately 30 feet by 25 feet. The ceiling was low, barely 6 feet high, supported by thick wooden beams. The floor was hard-packed earth, but in several places it had been disturbed, dug up and refilled. But it wasn't the disturbed earth that immediately drew their attention. It was the tables. 3 long wooden tables had been positioned in the center of the basement, arranged parallel to each other. They were similar to embalming tables used by undertakers, but modified, with restraints attached at intervals along the sides, leather straps that hung loose in the lamplight. The tables were stained dark, the wood saturated with fluids that had soaked in over months, possibly years. On and around these tables, Sheriff Thornton and his men found evidence of systematic desecration that went beyond murder into territory that challenged their understanding of human behavior. There were tools, surgical instruments, some purchased legitimately, others modified from common implements, scalpels, bone saws, curved needles and thick thread, syringes for injecting preservative fluids, bottles and jars containing chemicals, formaldehyde, carbolic acid, alcohol, arsenic solution. Everything needed for the preparation and preservation of human remains. But these remains had not been prepared for burial. They had been prepared for something else, entirely. On a shelf near the stairs, Sheriff Thornton discovered a collection of leather-bound journals. There were 8 of them in total, dating back to 1885. The first 4 were written in an older hand, later confirmed to be Nathaniel Sanders, the father. The remaining 4 were divided between Andrew's precise, controlled script and Matthew's more erratic, emotional handwriting. The journals documented everything, and I mean everything. Nathaniel's entries began innocuously enough: notes on funeral preparations, recipes for preservation fluids, observations on the decomposition process at different temperatures and humidity levels. But as the years progressed, his writings took on a disturbing quality. He began to express theories, bizarre, quasi-scientific ideas about the nature of death and the persistence of the soul. One entry from 1886 read, "Observed today that the deceased Mrs. Patterson, 3 days post-mortem, retained warmth in her hands when positioned near the stove. The body responds to external stimulus even after the spirit departs. This suggests the flesh maintains a form of memory separate from consciousness. Could this memory be sustained? Could the vessel be preserved not merely for burial, but for companionship?" companionship. That word appeared repeatedly in the later entries in all three men's handwriting. Nathaniel Sanders, it seemed, had developed an obsession with the idea that the dead could be preserved not just temporarily, but indefinitely, kept in a state that resembled life closely enough to serve as substitutes for human connection. He wrote about loneliness, about the isolation of their profession, about the purity of the dead compared to the corruption of the living. And he passed these ideas to his sons. Andrew's entries, beginning in 1888 after his father's death, showed a man attempting to rationalize and systematize his father's theories. He wrote detailed notes on preservation techniques, experiments with different chemical combinations, observations on the rate of decay under various conditions. His tone was clinical, detached, as if he were conducting legitimate scientific research rather than documenting unspeakable acts. But Matthew's entries revealed something darker, something more emotionally disturbed. "She doesn't judge," Matthew wrote in an entry dated April 1890, 1 month after Sarah Brennan's disappearance. "She doesn't turn away or speak cruel words. She is perfect in her silence, beautiful in her stillness." Andrew says, "I must not become attached, that this is a practice, an art we are perfecting. But how can I not feel affection for something so pure, so untainted by the world's corruption?" The journals documented 3 women, Sarah Brennan, Elizabeth Crane, Catherine Wells. But the entries suggested there might have been others, references to previous attempts and earlier subjects that dated back to 1889, before the known disappearances began. The disturbed earth in the basement floor yielded its secrets slowly and horribly. The men began to dig in the locations, indicated by staining and subsidence. 6 inches down in the first location, they found fabric, blue cotton, the same fabric Elizabeth Crane had purchased at the general store the day she disappeared. Beneath the fabric, wrapped in muslin cloth soaked in preservative chemicals, they found human remains. The body had been carefully prepared. The internal organs had been removed, a process called evisceration, common in embalming but executed here with disturbing precision. The cavity had been packed with preservative-soaked cotton. The skin had been treated with arsenic solution to prevent decomposition. The hair had been washed and arranged. The hands had been positioned as if in prayer, but the preservation had ultimately failed, as it always does. Despite the chemicals, despite the care, nature had begun to reclaim what belonged to it. The remains were in an advanced state of decay, recognizable as human, but no longer identifiable as any specific individual. In total, they found 3 bodies in that basement. 3 women who had been taken, killed, preserved, and kept like macabre dolls in the darkness beneath the Sanders house. But the horror didn't end with the bodies themselves. It was what had been done to them after death that truly revealed the depths of the brothers' depravity. The journals contained detailed entries about the brothers' interactions with the preserved corpses. They had dressed them in clothing taken from the victims' homes, clothing they had apparently stolen during the initial abductions or in subsequent night visits to the family's properties. They had posed them in chairs around a table in the basement, creating a grotesque parody of a dinner party, and according to Matthew's increasingly unstable journal entries, they had engaged in acts of necrophilia with the preserved bodies, treating them not as the dead, but as unwilling participants in a fantasy of companionship and control. "Andrew doesn't understand," Matthew wrote in an entry from August 1890. "He sees them as specimens, as experiments in our craft. But they are more than that. They are companions who will never leave, never betray, never age or change or become anything other than what we need them to be. In death, they have achieved a perfection that the living can never attain." Sheriff Thornton's official report, filed on June 22, 1891, was remarkable. for what it attempted to describe and what it carefully omitted. The full document was 23 pages long, written in the methodical language of law enforcement, yet even through that formal prose, the horror was palpable. The scene discovered in the basement of the Sanders property, Thornton wrote, represents a degree of moral depravity unprecedented in my 20 years of service. The subjects appear to have engaged in systematic abduction and murder, followed by acts of desecration that violate both law and fundamental human decency. The physical evidence, combined with written documentation found at the scene, leaves no doubt as to the guilt of Andrew and Matthew Sanders in the deaths of at least 3 women, and possibly more. But what the official report didn't include were the details that Thornton shared privately with the county prosecutor, and later, decades after, with his own grandson. Details about objects found in the basement that suggested ritualistic elements to the brothers' activities, about symbols carved into the wooden beams, not recognizable occult symbols, but strange personal iconography that seemed to represent the brothers' twisted philosophy about death and preservation, about a locked chest containing personal items taken from each victim, locks of hair, pieces of jewelry, fragments of clothing, arranged like trophies or relics, about letters written by the brothers to their dead companions, letters that expressed affection, gratitude, even love for corpses that could neither read nor respond. The deputies who witnessed the scene were sworn to discretion. The details were considered too disturbing for public knowledge, too likely to inspire panic or, worse, imitators. The families of the victims were told their daughters had been found, that they had been murdered, but not what had been done to them after death. Some mercies, it was decided, were necessary, but nothing could be kept entirely secret. Rumors spread. Whispers passed from house to house, and within weeks the entire county knew, or thought they knew, what had happened in the Sanders basement. The truth, as is often the case, was simultaneously more mundane and more horrifying than any rumor could capture. The Sanders brothers vanished on the night of June 19, 1891, the night before Sheriff Thornton arrived with his search warrant. They were never seen again, at least not in any way that could be confirmed. A massive manhunt was organized. Pazes searched the mountains and forests of Harlan County and beyond. Wanted posters were distributed throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. A reward of $500, substantial money in 1891, was offered for information leading to their capture. Law enforcement agencies across the region were alerted to watch for 2 men matching their descriptions. But Andrew and Matthew Sanders had disappeared as completely as their victims had. The trail went cold almost immediately. Some speculated they had fled west, lost themselves in the growing cities of the frontier. Others believed they had died in the mountains, succumbed to the elements, or perhaps taken their own lives out of guilt or fear. A few whispered that they had never left the area at all, that they were hiding in the vast cave systems that honeycomb the Appalachian region, emerging only at night to scavenge and survive. The Sanders homestead was burned to the ground in July of 1891. The decision was made by county officials who deemed the property too contaminated, too associated with evil, to ever be inhabitable again. The bodies of Sarah Brennan, Elizabeth Crane, and Catherine Wells were released to their families for proper burial. The journals and evidence were sealed in the county courthouse, with access restricted to law enforcement and legal officials only. And for a time, it seemed the story had ended. A horror discovered, justice attempted if not achieved, and a community left to heal from. Wounds that would never fully close. But decades later, fragments began to emerge, pieces of information that suggested the story of the Sanders brothers was not as finished as everyone had believed. In 1923, a cave explorer named Daniel Hutchins was mapping the extensive cave systems in the mountains northeast of Harlan County. Deep within one particular system, nearly 2 miles from the nearest entrance, he discovered signs of human habitation, a makeshift campsite, long abandoned, with remnants, that suggested someone had lived there for an extended period. Among the debris, Hutchins found a leather satchel containing a journal. The journal was water-damaged, many pages illegible, but portions could still be read. The handwriting matched samples from Matthew Sanders' journals found in 1891. The entries were dated between late June and September of 1891, suggesting Matthew had survived at least 3 months after fleeing the homestead. The legible passages were disturbing. Matthew wrote about betrayal, about Andrew abandoning him in the mountains, taking the supplies and leaving him to die. He wrote about hunger, about drinking from underground streams, about the darkness of the caves becoming a comfort rather than a terror. And he wrote about Catherine Wells, about missing her, about the mistake of leaving her behind when we had achieved such perfect preservation. The final legible entry, dated September 17, 1891, read, "I can hear them calling me, not the lawmen, but the others, the ones we kept. They want me to join them in the stillness, in the perfect quiet where judgment cannot reach." Andrew was wrong to run. We should have stayed. We should have descended into the earth with them and remained there forever, where the living world could never touch us again. The journal was turned over to authorities, but received little attention. Matthew Sanders had been missing for 32 years by that point. Whether he died in those caves in 1891 or somehow survived, longer remained unknown. His body was never found. In 1954, during the construction of a new highway through Harlan County, workers excavating a hillside approximately 8 miles from the location of the old Sanders property uncovered something unexpected. Buried 4 feet below the surface, they found a wooden box containing skeletal remains and personal effects. The remains were male, estimated to have been buried for several decades. Among the effects was a pocket watch engraved with the initials AS and a small leather notebook containing names, dates and locations written in Andrew Sanders' handwriting. The notebook appeared to be a record, a catalogue of some kind. It contained 13 entries. 3 matched the known victims: Sarah Brennan, Elizabeth Crane, Catherine Wells. But 10 other names were listed, with dates ranging from 1887 to 1890, names of women, some from Harlan County, others from neighboring regions, women who had been reported missing during those years, but whose disappearances had never been connected to the Sanders brothers. The discovery suggested that the horror uncovered in 1891 was far worse than anyone had imagined, that the 3 bodies found in the basement were not the beginning and end of the brothers' crimes, but merely the most recent, that Andrew and Matthew Sanders had been perfecting their terrible practice for years, disposing of failed attempts and keeping only their most successful preservations. Authorities attempted to investigate the additional names in the notebook, but after more than 60 years, the trail was impossibly cold. Families had died or moved away. Records were incomplete or lost. And without bodies, without evidence, there was no way to confirm whether these women had truly been victims of the Sanders brothers or merely names collected for some other unknown purpose. The remains found in 1954 were eventually buried in an unmarked grave after no family members could be located to claim them. The notebook was added to the sealed evidence from 1891, locked away in storage where it remains to this day. In 1982, the last fragment emerged. A retired historian named Margaret Calloway was researching Appalachian folklore when she encountered an elderly woman named Ruth Henderson, 93 years old, living in a nursing home in Lexington, Kentucky. Henderson had grown up in Harlan County in the early 1900s, and she claimed to have information about the Sanders brothers that had never been officially reported. According to Henderson, her grandfather, one of the deputies who had entered the Sanders basement in 1891, had told her something before he died in 1940. He said that when they were searching the basement, they found evidence of a tunnel. A narrow passage dug into the earth wall at the far end of the basement, extending back into the hillside. The passage was partially collapsed, and Sheriff Thornton had ordered it left alone, deemed too dangerous to explore. But Henderson's grandfather believed the tunnel went deeper than anyone realized. He believed it connected to the cave systems that ran throughout the region, and he believed that Matthew Sanders might have escaped through that tunnel on the night of June 19th, vanishing into the underground darkness where no one would ever find him. "My grandfather had nightmares about it until the day he died," Henderson told Calloway. "He dreamed about that tunnel, about what might be at the end of it, about whether Matthew Sanders was still down there somewhere in the dark with whatever he had taken with him." When asked what she thought her grandfather meant by whatever he had taken with him, Henderson said, "He never said exactly, but I always got the impression he meant Matthew didn't leave alone, that he took one of them with him into the caves, where he could keep her forever, where no one would ever find them or take her away." The tunnel was never explored. The location of the old Sanders homestead, though marked on historical maps, is now overgrown and nearly inaccessible. The cave systems of Harlan County remain largely unmapped, vast networks of darkness that could hide secrets for centuries. So what really happened to the Sanders brothers? Where did they go on that night in June 1891, and what became of them in the years that followed? The truth is, we don't know, and perhaps we never will. There are theories, of course. There are always theories when a story ends without resolution, when questions remain unanswered and the darkness refuses to give up its secrets. The first theory is the simplest. Andrew and Matthew Sanders died in the mountains shortly after fleeing their homestead. The Appalachian wilderness in 1891 was unforgiving, especially for men unprepared for survival in the wild. They could have succumbed to exposure, to starvation, to any number of dangers that lurked in those remote hollows. The skeletal remains found in 1954, if they truly belonged to Andrew Sanders, would support this theory. Perhaps both brothers died within months of their escape, their bodies lost to the forest, feeding the same earth they had violated with their crimes. But this theory leaves questions unanswered. If Andrew died and was buried with such care, enclosed in a wooden box with his personal effects, who buried him? Did Matthew survive long enough to perform that final service for his brother before succumbing himself? Or was someone else involved? Someone who knew the brothers and helped them escape, someone whose identity remains hidden even now. The second theory is darker and more disturbing. It suggests that one or both of the Sanders brothers survived their flight and continued their practices elsewhere. The notebook found with Andrew's remains contained names and dates extending up to 1890. But what if there were more names, more victims in other locations? What if the brothers separated after fleeing Harlan County, each carrying their father's terrible teachings to new communities where they were unknown, where they could start fresh and continue their work in secret? There are missing person cases throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia in the 1890s and early 1900s that have never been solved. Young women who vanished without a trace in communities similar to Harlan County. Isolated, rural, places where strangers could arrive and establish themselves without attracting much attention. Could some of these disappearances be connected to the Sanders brothers? We have no evidence, only the uncomfortable possibility that the horror discovered in 1891 was not an ending but a beginning, or more accurately, a brief interruption in something that continued elsewhere. The third theory is perhaps the most unsettling because it asks us to consider something almost supernatural in its implications. What if Matthew Sanders never left the caves? What if he descended into those underground passages with one of his preserved victims, just as the deputy suggested to his granddaughter, and remained there, living in the darkness, sustained by some obsession so powerful that it transcended normal human needs and limitations? The cave systems beneath Harlan County are vast, largely unexplored even today. There are passages that extend for miles, chambers that have never been mapped, underground rivers and lakes where light has never penetrated. Could a man survive there? Could he maintain his terrible practices in that perpetual darkness, unknown and undiscovered? It seems impossible, and yet the journal Matthew left behind in those caves speaks to a mindset that had long since departed from anything we might consider rational. A man who writes about joining his victims in the stillness, in the perfect quiet where judgment cannot reach, is not a man thinking about survival in conventional terms. To this day, there are stories. Cave explorers in the region occasionally report finding signs of old habitation in the deep passages, remnants of campsites, carved symbols on stone walls, artifacts that seem impossibly old, yet not ancient enough to be prehistoric. Are these the traces of Matthew Sanders, or merely the accumulated debris of decades of other explorers, other people who sought refuge in the Earth's hidden places? We cannot say. The darkness keeps its secrets well. What we can say with certainty is that the Sanders brothers, whatever became of them, left behind a legacy of horror that has never been forgotten in Harlan County. The names of Sarah Brennan, Elizabeth Crane, and Catherine Wells are remembered and honored. Their graves are maintained, their stories told to each new generation as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that the greatest monsters are not supernatural creatures, but human beings who have surrendered their humanity to obsession and madness. The journals remain sealed, the evidence remains locked away. And somewhere, in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in caves that wind through stone and darkness, there may still be secrets waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps some secrets are better left buried, better left to the earth and the silence and the passage of time that eventually claims all things, both innocent and guilty alike. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's darkest and least known historical mysteries. If you found this story compelling, if it made you think about the nature of evil and the questions that haunt us across generations, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We explore these forgotten corners of history, these stories that mainstream narratives overlook, because we believe that understanding the darkness is essential to appreciating the light. Leave a comment below with your theory about what happened to the Sanders brothers. Do you think they died in the mountains? Do you believe they escaped and continued their crimes elsewhere? Or is there something else, something we haven't considered that might explain their disappearance and the fragments of evidence that have emerged over the decades? Join our haunted community, share your thoughts, and remember, the past is never as dead as we like to believe. Sometimes it's just waiting in the darkness for someone to shine a light and ask the questions that everyone else has forgotten. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning the stories we think we know. This has been another investigation into the shadows of history. I'm Samuel, and I'll see you in the next episode.